Some folks said Jacob's stone had forgotten how to talk. Others claimed a wildfire had damaged his throat along with everything else it had taken from him that terrible spring 3 years past. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Jacob had simply decided that words were luxuries he could no longer afford. He'd been checking his high pasture fence when he saw her, a small dark shape against a white expanse of fresh snow. At first glance, she might have been a boulder or fallen log, but Jacob's eyes had learned to read the mountain landscape like scripture, and this shape didn't belong. The girl sat motionless beside a mound of carefully arranged stones, her threadbare coat inadequate against the Colorado mountain cold. Snow had accumulated on her shoulders and hair, suggesting she'd been there long enough to become part of the winter tableau. In her lap she held something Jacob couldn't quite make out from his position 50 yards away. Jacob's instinct was to retreat, to avoid whatever tragedy had brought a child to this remote spot in the mountains. 3 years of self-imposed isolation had taught him that other people's sorrows had a way of awakening his own carefully buried grief. But something about the girl's stillness, her obvious determination to maintain a vigil that might kill her, made him urge his horse closer. As he approached, details emerged that painted a picture of recent catastrophe. The girl was maybe 12, with auburn hair that had once been neatly braided, but now hung loose and tangled. Her dress, visible beneath the inadequate coat, had been torn and hastily mended. Most telling were her hands, raw and bloody from moving stones without gloves, evidence of desperate manual labor in freezing conditions. The mound she guarded was clearly a grave, marked with a crude wooden cross, bearing words Jacob could just make out. Tommy O'Brien, aged 10, beloved brother. The object in her lap was a tattered book, and her lips moved silently as she read, or pretended to read, from pages that were probably too damaged by weather to be legible. Jacob reined in his horse 20 feet away, close enough to speak but far enough to avoid startling her. Not that speaking was an option. His voice had rusted from disuse, and he'd learned to communicate through gestures and written notes when absolutely necessary. The girl looked up at his approach, and Jacob saw eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. They were green eyes, bright with intelligence and dulled with exhaustion, set in a face marked by recent hardship. Most striking was her complete lack of fear at his appearance. Either she was too far gone to recognize danger, or she simply didn't care what happened to her anymore. "He liked stories," she said, her voice hoarse from cold and disuse. "I'm reading him his favorite, about knights and dragons and people who save each other." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding that she was explaining her presence rather than greeting him. The book in her lap was indeed a collection of fairy tales, its pages warped and stained, but held together by a child's determination to preserve something precious. "Are you going to make me leave?" she asked, with the directness of someone who'd learned not to waste words on politeness. Jacob shook his head, though he wasn't sure what he could do for a child who seemed determined to freeze to death beside her brother's grave. His own cabin was a mile down the mountain, provisioned for one man's solitary existence. He hadn't spoken to another human being in months, hadn't entertained the idea of house guests since his wife's death. But he also couldn't ride away and leave a 12-year-old girl to die of exposure while reading fairy tales to a corpse. Jacob dismounted and walked slowly toward the grave, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Up close he could see that the girl had been living rough for days, possibly weeks. Her clothes were filthy beneath the snow, and her skin had the grayish pallor of someone who hadn't been eating regularly. The grave itself told a story of love and desperation. The stones had been carefully selected and arranged, the wooden cross carved with obvious care despite primitive tools. Someone had taken time to do things properly, to show respect for the dead even in circumstances that must have been dire. Jacob pulled a piece of paper and pencil stub from his coat pocket, writing carefully before showing it to the girl. "What happened?" She studied the words for a moment, then looked up at him with surprise. "You can't talk?" Jacob shook his head and pointed to his throat, then to the paper. It was easier than explaining the truth, that he could talk but had chosen not to, that silence had become his refuge from a world that demanded responses he couldn't give. "Bandits," she said simply, "3 days ago, maybe 4. Time gets mixed up when you're not sleeping much. They wanted our wagon, our horses, the money Papa had saved to buy land in California." Jacob wrote again. "Your parents?" "Dead. Papa first, when he tried to fight them off. Then Mama, when she tried to protect us." The girl's voice remained steady, but Jacob could see the effort it took to maintain composure. "Tommy and me, we hid in the rocks while they did what they did, but they found us eventually." Jacob waited, understanding that some stories had to be told at their own pace. "Tommy fought them," she continued. "He was only 10, but he fought like a man. Gave me time to get away, to hide where they couldn't follow. By the time I came back, sir," she gestured toward the grave, "he was gone. They all were. The bandits, I mean, took everything and left." Jacob wrote, "How long have you been here?" "Since I buried him. 3 days, maybe 4. I wanted to read him all his favorite stories before—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. Before she gave up, before she let the cold take her to wherever her family had gone. The practical part of Jacob's mind catalogued the situation. A traumatized child, alone in the mountains, without adequate food or shelter, determined to die beside her brother's grave rather than face a world that had shown her only cruelty. The emotional part of his mind, the part he'd been trying to silence for 3 years, recognized a kindred spirit, someone who'd lost everything and didn't know how to keep living. Jacob wrote carefully, then showed her the paper. "Come to my cabin. Get warm. Come back tomorrow." She shook her head firmly. "I can't leave him alone. He was scared of the dark when he was alive. What if he's still scared?" Jacob understood that logic, the magical thinking that grief used to make sense of senseless loss. He'd spent months after Sarah's death believing that her spirit was somehow tied to the ruins of their burned ranch house, that leaving the property would abandon her to loneliness. He wrote again, "I live close. You can see the grave from my porch. Watch over him from there." The girl considered this, looking from the paper to Jacob's face to the snow-covered mound that held her brother. "You promise? I can come back whenever I want?" Jacob nodded and wrote, "Promise." It took an hour to convince her to leave the graveside, and only then, because Jacob demonstrated that his cabin's porch did indeed have a clear view of the burial site. She insisted on covering the grave with pine boughs before leaving, whispering something to the stones that Jacob couldn't hear. As they walked down the mountain through deepening snow, the girl clutching her damaged book and looking back every few steps, Jacob wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd chosen isolation as protection against further loss, built walls of silence to keep the world at bay. Now he was inviting someone else's grief into his carefully controlled sanctuary. But watching the child trudge through snow that came up to her knees, seeing her fierce determination to honor her brother's memory even at the cost of her own life, Jacob felt something stir in his chest that he thought was permanently frozen. Not love. That was too dangerous, too complicated. But recognition, perhaps, understanding. They were both guardians of the dead, both keeping vigils that the living world didn't understand. Maybe that was enough to build on. Maybe that was how healing began, not with grand gestures or profound realizations, but with one broken person offering shelter to another, one step at a time through the snow. Jacob's cabin had been built for solitude. One room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with practical necessities. No decorations, no photographs, nothing that might trigger memories of the life he'd lost when the wildfire swept through the valley 3 years ago. Mary Catherine, she told him her full name during the walk from the grave, stood in the doorway taking inventory of his sparse living arrangements. Her green eyes missed nothing. The single plate and cup on the shelf, the clothes sized for one man, the absolute absence of anything suggesting visitors or family. "You really do live alone," she observed, settling the damaged fairy tale book carefully on his table as if it were made of gold instead of water-stained paper. Jacob nodded and gestured toward the fireplace where he'd already started building up the flames. The girl was shivering despite trying to hide it, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of serious exposure to cold. He pulled blankets from a chest and wrapped them around her shoulders, then moved to his small store of food. Beans, salt pork, hardtack, coffee. Supplies for a man who ate to survive rather than for pleasure. But there was also a precious jar of honey and some dried apples Sarah had put up before the fire. Provisions he'd been hoarding like a miser. Mary Catherine watched him prepare food with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted. "You really can't talk at all?" Jacob paused in his stirring and looked at her. After a moment's consideration, he opened his mouth and made a sound. Hoarse, barely recognizable as human speech. "Can," he whispered, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "Don't." Mary Catherine studied his face with the seriousness of someone much older. "Because it hurts too much to use words?" Jacob stirred the beans more vigorously than necessary, surprised by the girl's perceptiveness. Most adults assumed his silence was due to physical damage or mental deficiency. This 12-year-old understood that some wounds went deeper than flesh. "My mama said talking about sad things makes them real," Mary Catherine continued. "But not talking about them makes them grow like weeds in the dark." Jacob served her a bowl of beans and hardtack, adding a spoonful of precious honey when he saw how she struggled to eat the plain food. 3 years of mountain solitude had made him forget how terrible his cooking actually was. "Tell me about your wife," Mary Catherine said suddenly. Jacob's hand stilled on his own bowl. He looked at her with surprise and something that might have been panic. "I can see her things," Mary Catherine explained, gesturing toward subtle evidence Jacob thought he'd hidden. "That quilt wasn't made by man hands. And there's still 2 pegs by the door, even though you only hang 1 coat now." Jacob set down his spoon and pulled out his paper and pencil. After a long pause, he wrote, "Sarah, died in wildfire. I was away checking cattle." Mary Catherine read the words carefully. "You blame yourself." It wasn't a question, and Jacob couldn't bring himself to deny it. If he'd been home, if he'd chosen a different day to ride the far pastures, if he'd ignored the missing cattle and stayed close to the ranch. Tommy blamed himself too, Mary Catherine said quietly, for not being big enough to fight off all the bandits, for not saving Mama and Papa. But Mama told him once that blame is just another way of pretending we have control over things we can't control. Jacob wrote again, "Wise mother." She read books, lots of books, said wisdom came from other people's stories, not just your own troubles. Mary Catherine held up the damaged fairy tale collection. This was hers when she was little. She gave it to Tommy, and Tommy loved the dragon stories best. Jacob understood that she was sharing sacred things, memories that were all she had left of her family. The act of trust moved him in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He went to a trunk in the corner and pulled out something he hadn't touched in 3 years. A small wooden horse, carved with obvious skill and polished smooth from handling. Sarah had been teaching herself to whittle, producing dozens of small animals she'd planned to give to the children they hoped to have someday. "Sarah made this," Jacob whispered, his voice still hoarse from disuse. For children who never came." Mary Catherine accepted the wooden horse with the reverence it deserved, turning it over in her small hands. She was going to be a good mother. Yes? Were you going to be a good father? The question hung between them like smoke from the fire. Jacob had never articulated his dreams about fatherhood, had never spoken aloud his hopes for teaching children to read the land, to understand the rhythm of seasons, to find peace in the mountain silence that had become his refuge. "Wanted to be," he admitted. Mary Catherine nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Tommy wanted to be a cowboy, said he'd have the biggest ranch in California with horses that could run faster than the wind." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people sharing grief over different losses, but similar regrets. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in the kind of pristine white that made everything look possible again. "Can I stay tonight?" Mary Catherine asked eventually. "I want to see Tommy's grave from the window. When the moon comes up, make sure he's not scared." Jacob nodded and began making preparations for an overnight guest, the first he'd had since Sarah's death. He'd sleep on the floor, give Mary Catherine the bed, figure out how to stretch his supplies to feed 2 people instead of 1. But as he watched the girl curl up by the fire with her brother's favorite book, reading softly aloud so her voice would carry through the window toward the distant grave, Jacob realized that silence wasn't the only thing being broken tonight. For the first time in 3 years, his cabin felt like it might become a home again. Mary Catherine had been staying at the cabin for a week when the first real test of their arrangement came. Jacob woke before dawn to find her bed empty and the front door standing open, letting precious heat escape into the frigid mountain air. He found her at Tommy's grave, kneeling in fresh snow, with tears frozen on her cheeks, clutching the wooden horse Sarah had carved. The temperature had dropped well below freezing during the night, and the girl was shaking so violently she could barely speak. "I forgot," she whispered when Jacob approached. "I forgot to tell him the end of the dragon story yesterday. What if he's been waiting all night to hear how it ends?" Jacob knelt beside her in the snow, his practical mind cataloging signs of hypothermia, while his heart broke for a child who'd appointed herself guardian of a brother who no longer needed protecting. Without speaking, he wrapped his heavy coat around both of them and simply waited. "The night defeats the dragon," Mary Catherine continued through chattering teeth. "But he's wounded, and he thinks he's going to die alone in the forest. Then a princess finds him and helps him heal, and they take care of each other forever after." Jacob understood that she wasn't just finishing a story for Tommy. She was working through her own questions about healing, about whether broken people could ever really be whole again. He'd been asking himself the same question since the fire took Sarah. Instead of carrying Mary Catherine back to the cabin immediately, Jacob did something that surprised them both. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, telling her about the mountain wildlife that lived through harsh winters by helping each other survive. "Bears," he said, his voice rough but audible. "Mother bears and cubs. Cubs don't know enough to survive alone. Mothers teach them which berries are safe, where to find water when streams freeze. But sometimes mother bears die and cubs have to find new families. Other bears, unrelated bears, who choose to care for orphans." Mary Catherine looked at him with eyes that were gradually warming with understanding. Mountain goats too, Jacob continued, herd animals. When one is injured, the others don't abandon it. They adjust their pace, find easier paths, share body heat during storms. Survival isn't about being strong alone, it's about choosing to be strong together. Is that what we're doing? Mary Catherine asked. Choosing to be strong together? Jacob met her gaze directly. If you want to. It took 2 more hours by the fire before Mary Catherine stopped shivering, and Jacob spent that time teaching her practical lessons about mountain survival, how to read weather signs, how to conserve body heat, how to recognize the difference between manageable risk and deadly foolishness. Tommy's grave will still be there tomorrow, he explained, and next week and next year. But if you freeze to death visiting it, who's going to remember his stories? Who's going to tell people about the brave boy who fought bandits to save his sister? Mary Catherine considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. You would, if I taught them to you. I would, Jacob confirmed. But it would be better if you were there to tell them yourself. That afternoon, Jacob began teaching Mary Catherine the skills she'd need to survive a mountain winter, not just as his temporary guest, but as someone who might choose to stay longer. He showed her how to split wood without injuring herself, how to read the weather in cloud formations, how to preserve food and ration supplies. Mary Catherine proved to be a quick learner with natural instincts for reading the land. She had her brother's courage and her mother's intelligence, combined with the survival skills of someone who'd already faced more hardship than most adults. Where did you learn all this? She asked as Jacob demonstrated how to track deer through snow. My father, Jacob replied, and his father before him. Stone family has been ranching these mountains for 40 years. We learn the land because the land teaches us how to live. Will you teach me to be a real mountain person? Jacob paused in examining deer tracks, struck by the weight of her question. She wasn't just asking for survival skills, she was asking if he'd accept her as family, if he'd pass on the knowledge that connected him to his own heritage. Would you want that? He asked carefully. I want to belong somewhere again, Mary Catherine said simply. I want to have a home that isn't just about missing the people who aren't there anymore. Jacob understood exactly what she meant. His cabin had become a shrine to loss, rather than a place for living. But watching Mary Catherine bring life to the silent rooms, reading aloud, asking questions, filling the emptiness with purposeful activity, he realized that honoring the dead didn't require abandoning the possibility of joy. That evening, Jacob made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He pulled out a battered book he'd hidden away since Sarah's death, a journal where she'd recorded her observations about mountain plants, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior. Sarah was keeping track of everything she learned, he explained, showing Mary Catherine pages covered with careful notes and detailed sketches. She wanted to understand how the mountain worked, how all the pieces fit together. Mary Catherine studied the journal with reverence, recognizing it as another sacred gift. She was very smart. She was, and she would have wanted someone to continue her work. Jacob met Mary Catherine's eyes. Someone who could learn from what she started and add their own discoveries. Me? If you want to. Mary Catherine clutched the journal like the treasure it was. I do want to. I want to learn everything she knew and everything you know and everything the mountain can teach me. Then that's what we'll do. We'll learn together. As snow continued to fall outside, covering Tommy's grave in fresh white that would protect it through the winter, Jacob and Mary Catherine began planning for a future neither had imagined possible a week earlier. Not a temporary arrangement born of crisis, but a deliberate choice to build something new from the pieces of their broken lives. Jacob taught Mary Catherine to read Sarah's careful handwriting. Mary Catherine taught Jacob that talking about loss didn't have to multiply pain. Sometimes it divided it, making grief manageable by sharing its weight. They were both still guardians of the dead, still carrying love for people who would never return. But they were also choosing to become guardians of each other, committed to ensuring that love continued in new forms. The mountain winter would be long and harsh, but they would face it together. A silent rancher who was learning to speak again, and an orphaned girl who was learning that home could be rebuilt from scratch, when the right people decided to trust each other with their broken hearts. Spring came late to the high country, arriving in tentative bursts of warmth that melted snow into rushing streams and coaxed wildflowers from frozen ground. Jacob and Mary Catherine marked the changing season by visiting Tommy's grave together, replacing winter's pine boughs with fresh flowers. "He would have loved seeing this," Mary Catherine said, gesturing toward the meadow where columbines bloomed. "Tommy always said spring was proof that everything could start over if you waited long enough." Jacob nodded, understanding she was talking about more than seasonal change. The girl who'd been determined to freeze beside her brother's grave had become a young woman who understood that living was the best way to honor the dead. "Your brother was wise, but I think he learned that wisdom from his sister." Mary Catherine smiled, genuine happiness that transformed her face. "Mama always said we taught each other. That's what families do." The word family no longer felt dangerous. Over the winter, they'd built something that transcended blood relations, a partnership based on mutual care and shared work. "We need to go to town," Jacob announced one morning. "Supplies for summer, and there are legal matters to settle." Mary Catherine looked up from Sarah's journal where she'd been recording wildflower observations. "Legal matters?" "Adoption papers, if you're willing. Making you legally my daughter, so no one can question your place here." Mary Catherine studied his face with serious attention. "Would that make you happy?" "Would it make you happy?" I asked first. Jacob smiled at her stubbornness. "Yes, it would make me very happy. I want people to know you belong here, that this is your home by right." "Then yes, I want to be Mary Catherine Stone. I want to carry your name and Mama's memory and Tommy's stories all together." The trip to town was Mary Catherine's first venture into civilization since the bandit attack. She stayed close to Jacob, overwhelmed by noise and crowds after months of mountain silence. The legal proceedings took most of the day. The territorial judge was skeptical of a silent rancher's ability to raise a young girl until Mary Catherine spoke up. "Mr. Stone saved my life," she told the judge with quiet dignity. "He taught me to survive in the mountains, to honor my family's memory while building a new future. He's given me everything a good father should give: safety, education, love, and the knowledge that I matter to someone." The judge studied them both. "And you want this adoption, Miss O'Brien? You understand it's permanent?" "I understand that family is what you make it. Mr. Stone and I have already made ourselves into a family. The papers just make it official." The adoption was approved that afternoon. As they rode home through mountain passes beginning to show green, both carried the quiet satisfaction of people who'd chosen their future deliberately. "What happens now?" Mary Catherine asked as they crested the ridge, revealing their valley. "Now we live. We work the ranch, tend the animals, watch the seasons change. We visit Tommy's grave and read Sarah's journal and make new memories." "Will you teach me to carve wood like Sarah did?" "If you want to learn." "Will you tell me stories about her?" Jacob was quiet, considering a request that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Yes, I'll tell you about Sarah, about the dreams we shared and how much she would have loved having a daughter like you." As they rode into their valley, Jacob realized that healing hadn't come from forgetting the past, but from choosing to let love expand beyond loss. Sarah would always be part of his story. Tommy would always be part of Mary Catherine's, but their shared future was something new. The cabin that had been a monument to solitude became a home filled with conversation and laughter. Mary Catherine continued Tommy's story by living fully, and Jacob honored Sarah's memory by choosing to love again in a different way. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch reading aloud, sometimes from Tommy's fairy tales, sometimes from Sarah's journal, sometimes from new books. Their voices carried across the meadow where columbines bloomed over Tommy's grave. The silent rancher had found his voice again. The orphaned girl had found a home worth keeping, and in the high country of Colorado Territory they had proven that love was more powerful than loss, that family was more about loyalty than blood, and that even the most broken hearts could learn to heal together.